to Lindamood-Bell Radio. I'm Dave Hungerford. Every year, schools partner with Lindamood-Bell to make the most of summer learning. Our intensive reading camps provide high-impact tutoring for students and professional learning opportunities for teachers. Students can catch up in reading, language comprehension, and math. Teachers learn evidence-based language and literacy programs that are grounded in the science of reading. Schedule a free consultation with Lindamood-Bell for schools. We'll discuss your summer school plans and how we can help. Get started at lindamoodbell.com or call 800-233-1819. Today's episode is a Leaders in Literacy webinar, implementing reading interventions aligned with state dyslexia mandates.
Welcome to Lindamood-Bell's Leaders in Literacy webinar. My name is Dave Kiyvyra, and I'm the director of Lindamood-Bell for Schools. And I'm going to be talking today a little bit about reading difficulties as a whole and what it is that's happening with reading difficulties, a little bit about dyslexia as well, but how reading difficulties, dyslexia coming out of the pandemic are all impacting how it is that districts are having to struggle with students, especially around an increasing number of students who are being placed into special education. And joining me today to help with that discussion is Dr. Andrea Stolar, who's the Director of Special Education from Chicopee Public Schools. Andrea, you'd like to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Dr. Andrea Stoller. I've been in special education for 32 years, and I've been a special education director in an urban district, which is Chicopee Public Schools, for the last 10 years. We are very excited to tell you today all about what we're doing with Lindamood-Bell and our expansion this year. So I look forward to sharing some of the great work we're doing here in Chicopee. Thank you for having me.
Great. I'm so glad you could join us, Andrea. We've always had students who've been being referred to special education primarily because they have a difficulty with reading and they may get a label like SLD. And often we know that those students don't necessarily need to be in special education, that if we could get them the right reading instruction, they wouldn't necessarily end up being referred because special education isn't always where they should end up going. And that has really increased as a result of the learning that a lot of students missed during the pandemic. And so, Andrea, I know that that's something that's really hit you guys hard and is maybe like a little bit of a preview of what we're going to talk about later. I know you've gotten a ton of referrals this year.
Yes.
Great. Okay. And so if we dive into what we're going to talk about overall, we're going to start off the conversation talking a little bit about what is causing some of these reading difficulties for students and how we can begin to apply a theoretical model to address those reading difficulties. We'll talk a lot about what the sensory cognitive functions are that underlie students' reading. Particularly, I want to discuss how Andrea and Chicopee are introducing that sensory cognitive instruction into their district, and particularly discuss how they're applying job-embedded professional development to help teachers be able to take the knowledge that they're gaining in initial workshops and apply it in real time over the course of the year as they're working with students. So we'll start really big picture first and talk just generally about what it is that's happening with students when they're struggling with reading. And historically, when folks think about struggling readers, whether they're classified as students with dyslexia or not, the focus has really been about recognizing that there's a phonological component of language and focusing on that phonological component as the primary reason why students are struggling with learning how to read. And so in response to that, folks have really geared a lot of reading programs around extensively and deeply focusing on phonology. The challenge is that we at Lindamood-Bell discovered this ourselves. When we were first founded over 30 years ago, we were very heavily invested in designing and implementing a program that focused very heavily on phonemic awareness, specifically on developing students' articulatory feedback so they could feel sounds as a way to underlie phonological awareness and then tie that phonological awareness ultimately to letters. The challenge was that by going through that process of developing articulatory feedback, we saw great gains in terms of students' phonological awareness and their phoneme awareness and their ability to then sound out words on the page as long as those words played fair. The issue was that they couldn't hold on to sight words, and they could sound out a word in one paragraph, but wouldn't necessarily recognize that same word when they came across it in the next paragraph. And so we realized through conducting and participating in a lot of research that thinking about students' struggles with reading as being primarily phonologically based may be somewhat overly simplistic, right? That research really does show that there's a sensory cognitive function of symbol imagery that's necessary for bridging the phonological and orthographic components of reading. And so we want to talk a little bit about what symbol imagery is, but I think, the important piece to hold on to here is that symbol imagery really does concurrently address both the phonological and the orthographic components of reading, right? And that by bridging those two pieces together, we can make some really significant gains for students who are struggling with reading, whether they're classified as students with dyslexia or not. And so, Andrea, I know you've had some coffee today. So I'm going to challenge you right off the bat by showing you a word. It's not even a real word, just a complete nonsense word. And if I show Andrea this word for a second and then I take it away, so she can't see it anymore, I could still say to her, Andrea, what did that word say?
Lisp.
Flisp. Excellent. And when you say flisp, Andrea, I'm now going to ask some questions to her to see how well she's holding on to it, even though she can't see it anymore. Andrea, what'd you picture for your third letter in flisp?
I.
An I. Great. What sound did I make?
Eh.
Yeah, excellent. If we erase the I and we change it to an A, what would that word say?
Flasp.
Flasp. Nice job. Can you still picture all those letters in your mind, Andrea?
Yep.
Excellent. What if we switch the last two letters around? What would it say now?
Flasp. Flaps. Excuse me.
Flaps. Nice. I like how you fixed that. That was great.
I had to actually close my eyes and picture it. I really did.
Excellent. That's excellent. And that is, and what Andrea is doing is developing that ability to A, picture the letters in her mind, and then B, compare it to a change that I had asked her to do. And that's critical. That ability to hold and compare, right, is what students need to be able to do when they're making mistakes. And then they need to be empowered to recognize that they can fix those mistakes themselves, right? So that's good symbol imagery, is that ability to hold on to letters in their minds. And as you all can picture, that ability is really key to students' ability to learn how to read accurately and fluently on the page. So symbol imagery really is the mental imagery for sounds and letters within words, and it's a sensory cognitive function for both orthographic and phonological processing. And when we think about a diagram that lots of folks are very familiar with, which is Scarborough's reading rope, can think about how that symbol imagery skill that we were just talking about really relates down to that word recognition area, right? Good symbol imagery and phonemic awareness underlies students' ability to work on those initial pieces of the rope, right? And as they begin to intertwine, be able to do those activities more and more automatically. Less attention has really, and so again, we have paid tons and tons of attention, especially around state mandates on students with dyslexia and focusing on word recognition. There's been less focus on the language comprehension piece of reading, right? And to the extent that there's been a recognition that, yep, students need well-developed vocabulary, they need background knowledge, they need verbal reasoning. The good question to ask is, how do they develop the underlying cognitive function that will help them be able to do all of those tasks, right? If we know symbol imagery and phoneme awareness are the underlying cognitive functions for word recognition, what's the underlying cognitive function for language comprehension? Right? And we think about Scarborough's reading rope. We also think about it we tend to think about it and talk about it as a language processing spectrum, right? That ranges from students who have a weakness in symbol imagery, who will struggle with decoding, and so might be classified as students with dyslexia or just students who are struggling with reading. And at the other end of that, we've got students who struggle with a different type of imagery, not the ability to hold on to those letters in their mind, but to be able to hold on to pictures for the language in their mind. And that's what's called good concept imagery. And if you struggle with concept imagery, you're likely to struggle with both reading and oral language comprehension. At the far end of that spectrum might be students with autism, many of whom are hyperlexic, so they can't decode, they can decode, but they can't comprehend what they just decoded, right? And then you've got students who are sprinkled throughout that language processing spectrum with varying degrees of strengths and weaknesses. And I wanted to take a quick minute to dive a little bit more into the theory that underlies all of this discussion, right? And that's the dual coding theory, which is a theory of cognition created by a gentleman named Alan Pavio. Dual coding theory is recognized as one of the strongest candidates for a unified theory of literacy. And Alan Pavio was the gentleman who came up with the dual coding theory. And he talked about cognition, or our ability to understand things, is directly related to the extent to which we can integrate language and imagery together, so that as words are coming in, whether I'm reading them off the page or someone's talking to me, I can create pictures for that language in my mind. And someone else, Andrea, can understand me to the extent that I can take the pictures that are in my mind, use words to describe them sufficiently that she can create those same pictures in her mind. And that we have to understand that individuals are going to vary widely in terms of their ability to access that type of imagery. And so concept imagery really is what helps students create. I tend to call it a kind of a movie in your mind for language as it's coming in. Nancy Bell likes to talk about how it's a gestalt, or the whole. And it is what prevents language from coming in one ear and going out the other. And that concept imagery really is crucial to all of these different things that we want students to be able to do, right? They need to be adept at not just written language comprehension, but also oral language comprehension, critical thinking and problem solving, the ability to follow directions. I think about these next two as really crucial. We spend an enormous amount of time in school focused on writing, but oftentimes less focused on developing the underlying verbalization that students need in order to write, right? First, you can't expect them to write a good main idea if they can't verbalize a good main idea to you. And they can't verbalize a good main idea to you unless they can picture what the main idea of the story is. Social situations, cause and effect. I also think a big one that's not listed on here is attention. Often students are recognized as having an attention issue. The reason often that they don't pay attention in class is because they don't understand what's going on, right? So they may not actually have a separate attention issue. It's simply that they can't conceptualize what's going on in the class, so they aren't, quote unquote, paying attention, right? So big picture, that's how we think about the difficulties that underlie students' ability to learn how to read. And that can be a challenge that they may have always had, or it can be a challenge that gets exacerbated by something like schools shutting down and students not having access to instruction that'll intentionally and systematically develop those sensory cognitive functions. And so, Andrea, you're sort of living in a world in which you're seeing a lot of students who have not gotten that type of intentional and systematic instruction. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you're facing.
Sure, I would love to. So I'm going to start with what brought me here initially to expand what I was doing for Lindamood-Bell reading program in my district. We always had Lindamood-Bell in my language learning disabilities program, and it was always something for the past, I think, 10 years, something we've been doing. So, and we saw great results with it. Then here comes the pandemic, and now we have students who we know are behind, right? And trying to decide, are these students with disabilities, or are these students who truly just need, some explicit direct instruction to catch up? Are they on that? Are they, like a house built on a faulty foundation? Do we need to plug some holes? So we have a lot of questions going on. And I really wanted to implement some class-wide tier 2 interventions. That was one of my thought processes, was to take students who are in inclusion, gen ed and special ed, and say, okay, here's some kids that are really struggling. What can we give them so that we can bring them up and get them to where they need to be? but I didn't want to compromise because I feel like students should never have to choose between remediation and access to a rich, diverse, grade level appropriate curriculum. So we do this with what we call the multi-tiered system of support. So we have whole group instruction, and then we have small groups within the classroom. So one of those groups, when they're rotating amongst the classroom, is their Lindamood-Bell reading group. We really had to do some rethinking about like our assessments, our core instruction, our explicit direct instruction, and not over-identifying students, you know? So I think those are really big things that big picture things that were hitting us. And also Massachusetts is one of the states that now has dyslexia guidelines. So those dyslexia guidelines help us in terms of setting some screening guidelines, to give us a framework for interventions, providing a comprehensive research for evidence-based practices. So putting all those things together, we implemented this Tier 2 Lindamood-Bell programming, which is amazing, which I believe is crucial to what we need for these students who are really struggling to be good readers, you know, to understand what they're reading, to be successful.
Yeah.
So my district, to look at some of the things that we're doing, we have 26.5% students that are labeled as, you know, specific learning disability under our eligibility label. Our special ed initial referral rates has tripled. We have processed 182 referrals this year, and I have 65 more referrals waiting. So we have an astounding number of new initial referrals for people who are saying, these kids are struggling. Help. What do we do? We have a significant increase in ELL students moving in, and I believe all teachers need to be able to teach reading, and we need to help them with that tool bag. We need to give them those strategies. We use a multi-tiered system of support, and I was part of a literacy committee, and one of the things we looked at as part of our Massachusetts Department of Education was talking about what are teachers being taught when they're in college, so that they come prepared, so that they're able to have those tricks and those tool bags and strategies as well. And something I did for my district is I developed a PowerPoint that I share with all my staff. And it talks about things like what should you expect at grade K? What should you expect to look at for kids who are at grade 1? What are terms that we learned when we were in college that we probably forgot, like open syllables and things like that. And then I also developed a checklist for IST teams, which are like teams that are talking about kids who are struggling. And it's a nice checklist that they can look at and look at what are students struggling with. So they can check off, yes, they're struggling with this. Yes, they're struggling with this. And we can really put a comprehensive plan together for students. If you want to turn to the next slide, I can talk to you about our approach currently and what we're doing. So, of course, I have the picture of my leaky bucket because here we are trying to plug all of our holes. We have trained several teachers in addition to the teachers who were already trained in my district. We did this over the summer. I now have 12 new additional Tier 2 groups running in elementary classrooms. That is amazing. We're so happy. We're looking at things like our NWEA data and our DIBELS data and seeing great results. The other thing I did was I have 2 classrooms that are doing talkies. Talkies is the Lindamood-Bell program for students with autism. And it is new for this person that's doing the talkies instruction. But she and I have spoken several times, and she's really happy to be doing it, and she really likes the program, and she is getting coaching from Lindamood-Bell. So everyone across the district who's using Lindamood-Bell is getting the Lindamood-Bell coaching. This particular person is doing it 2 days a week because this is new to her and we really want to support her. The extra layer that I implemented, because I think it's really important, is I also have a special ed reading coach, and that reading coach is there in the classroom that travels throughout the district and supports these groups. So we have the Lindamood-Bell coaching going on. We have the reading coach to support staff, because my belief is that we give so much PD to people and then they go to implement it. And if people aren't feeling like, am I doing this right? Or if something fails, they don't have something to turn to, they're not going to do it, or it's not going to be successful. So giving teachers the support they need will help them to continue using the program, which is in the best interest of our students. This needs to be done, any reading program. Instruction needs to be done with fidelity on a daily basis. So those are some important elements in my mind in terms of programming. And I'm really happy to say that I feel like, or I believe, I believe that this has made a huge difference in students and teachers' self-confidence, success, ability to be empowered because the children feel like, hey, I've got strategies and tools. I know how to do this now. I can break down these words. I'm not afraid. And the teachers are empowered because, hey, I know how to do this. I can teach someone to read. I have what I need. I have the tricks in the tool bags. And then if I need help, I have some helplines. I have the coaching. I have the person directly working with me, and I have a special ed coordinator that coordinates the whole program, and myself. So I feel like we have made a lot of layers of support because people need mentoring, and the better we are, the better we instruct, the better it is for the kids.
You made so many great points in there, Andrea. Thank you. One of the things that I think is so powerful about what you were saying is that when one of the struggles districts are really having is all the turnover, right? So many people are leaving the special education field. And I think what's under-recognized sometimes is they're leaving because they don't feel like they can have an impact with their students. They don't necessarily feel like they're making a difference, or if they do, they don't feel like they have the support to really continue to grow in response to where their student struggles are. And I think that's so powerful that when you put those pieces in place and you really do help people feel like they're making an impact for students and that they have the support that they need to grow, that you're more likely to keep those people continuing to work in Chicopee, right? And that hopefully you'll have less sort of staff turnover over time, because teachers are feeling like they're making an impact. Yep. And that they're valued and that they see that value in the support that you're putting into their growth.
I wanted to add one more thing that when visiting classrooms, I also have students, I have a moderate needs program. So students with moderate disabilities that have intellectual impairment, they are using a curriculum. I have bought a program for a true curriculum, because the gen ed curriculum is a little different for these students. So we actually have a curriculum now for our students in our moderate needs classroom. And when I was visiting, I was so impressed to see that they were taking this program and using the Seeing Stars program and taking words and vocabulary words and implementing it. It was the greatest mesh of using a curriculum and using a reading intervention I have seen. I was so impressed with, I have 3 teachers there and they're all doing it. So it was impressive to see.
That's fantastic, Andrea. And I really appreciate you sharing all of those details about Chicopee. And I think, one of the other things that I noticed that you talked about in here was that you train teachers as well as paraprofessionals, so that they could also be out there implementing the program as well. And we have seen really phenomenal success with paraprofessionals using the programs also. In a little bit of what was so exciting to hear you talk about, Andrea, was that the professional development model, that sort of ongoing job embedded PD model, really aligns with what the research shows that teachers need, right? That teachers do need the opportunity to have and observe really good lessons, co-teach with an expert, and then get feedback on their teaching over time. And so the model that Andrea is describing is that Lindamood-Bell provides virtual job embedded PD. So it's over Zoom, and our consultants are live in the session to model lessons, co-teach with the teacher, provide feedback. And they do that, generally speaking, for a session a week over the course of an entire school year. So the teacher gets the full scope and sequence of the program and gets support through that entire time.
And Dave,
Yeah.
Can I add something? Another piece to that is that then we all meet, the teachers included, and I actually attended one of those meetings yesterday, and they talk about, here's some strategies, here's some other things to try, here's some things you could do, here's some wording. Does anybody have any ideas of how they do this? It was great because all my teachers then get together and talk almost like a PLC with the Lindamood-Bell person. It was awesome.
That's dynamite. And so Andrea is doing a great job of implementing this in Chicopee. Other districts across the country have also been following this same sort of model, one of which is a very large district in Atlanta, Georgia, Fulton County Schools, they've trained all of their special education teachers from K through 12 across the entire district over the last, I think we've been partnering together for 4 years now. And their tier 3 groups are getting instruction for 30 to 45 minutes a day. It varies by school. There's lots of challenges that the district faces around attendance and around getting group sizes to 5 students or fewer, things that we would like to see. And yet when they looked at their iReady results, they were really excited last year to see how much growth their students were making. At the start of the year, in particular, I like to look at the number of students who were on level. At the start of the year, they had only 28 of their special education students who were on level. And by the end of the year, they had 182 of those kids on level. And that's really dramatic because if we know that most of the students in special ed, or the largest proportion of students in special ed are, as you described earlier, SLD students, right? And the primary reason students get labeled with SLD is because they struggle with reading. Then if I'm getting 182 of my kids on level with reading, that means I can start to have some conversations about, do these kids need to be in special education anymore? In aggregate, the kids met 130% of their typical growth, 60% of their stretch growth. That's the growth they need to close gaps. 22% of their kids met 100% of their stretch growth, which is really fantastic to see. And again, I think that conversation that they get to have is one that we had with another district that we partnered with, and they looked at their special education exits. And we began partnering with them in 2017. And previously, they looked at the previous 4 years before we started partnering with them, and they'd exited about 86 students from special education. And they then started implementing the Seeing Stars program for students struggling with decoding, visualizing and verbalizing for students struggling with language comprehension and critical thinking. And by doing so, they, over those next 4 years that they started implementing intentional and systematic Lindamood-Bell sensory cognitive instruction, they exited 226 kids from special education. So a huge jump in the number of students who were now becoming proficient in reading and comprehension and able to exit from special ed. And I'll close just by talking a little bit, we talked at the outset about students with dyslexia. That same district that I was just discussing, we were able to take a look at their students who were classified as being students with characteristics of dyslexia. We gave them nationally normed assessments at the start of the year that measured all of these different components of reading. And then we reassessed them at the end of the year after they'd gotten about 57 hours of small group instruction. And we would have loved to have seen, more like 80 to 120 hours, but this is where we were able to get to last school year coming out of the pandemic. But you can see that they made statistically significant gains in all of the component parts of reading, including phonemic awareness and word recognition, and that those gains bumped their comprehension, which was one of their highest scores on the pretest, from below the normal range right into the normal range, which was very exciting to see because as we could improve the students' reading accuracy, that naturally led to an increase in their reading comprehension, right? And that those changes were actually very large standard score changes for all of those areas. So those are the things that I wanted to make sure we kind of talked about today. And Andrea, I really appreciate you talking about Chicopee. And I don't know if you had any closing thoughts you wanted to kind of share.
I'm very happy to have an opportunity to tell everyone about what we've just begun this year. And I'm hoping to present some results with, pre and post results like I've seen, and we are an urban district, we do struggle with such things as attendance and, having, we squeezing out, 30 minutes a day to try to get an intervention in. So I totally, when I see those results, it only gets me more excited to say, here we go, let's go, we can do this. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I really appreciate you coming on. And that's the end of our webinar for today. I hope you all have enjoyed this. There's a whole series of Leaders in Literacy webinars available on our website, which is lindamood-bell.com. Sneaky trick, you can also just type in lblp.com, and it's much easier. And if you click on For Schools, there's a whole list of webinars that you can get to, in which we're talking about how to implement these programs and talking with other folks out in the field, such as Andrea and other school districts, discussing how it is that they've implemented Lindamood-Bell and some of the challenges that they've faced and overcome. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at another webinar in the future.
And thank you for listening. Learn more about us at lindamood-bell.com. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We are Lindamood-Bell.